Well, I'm joined now by former FBI Special Agent Bobby Chacon in Palm Springs, California, and former member of the Israeli counterterrorist unit, Aaron Cohen, who joins me from Los Angeles. I'm going to start with you, Bobby. First of all, this is more reminiscent of the Westminster Bridge attack there, where it was a very low-tech attack with a vehicle and then knives. Very unlike really what we saw in Manchester, where it appeared as though the terrorist had had some sort of specialized training. What do you make of an attack like this? What should we make of it?
Well, I would make of it certainly, and of course this is before we know anything about it. I would make of it these guys may have self-radicalized. They may have operated independently, and that will be found out. And I could be wrong, but for me, something like this says these are three guys that possibly radicalized. I'm assuming it's another Ramadan attack. We've had dozens of them around the world. We're only in day 8 of Ramadan. So it looks like these guys, because of the low-tech style, they probably didn't have the support and the planning that went into the Manchester bombing last week, but that they were inspired somehow by ISIS ideology or radical ideology. And so we may not find the same network that was found in Manchester.
Aaron Cohen, you can't really protect the city the size of London from these attacks. They could be inspired by ISIS, not directed by ISIS. It's virtually impossible to prevent them.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think that there's a lot more that can be done, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. Take the Ariana Grande concert, for instance. A little bit of surveillance on a venue that holds 30,000 people. The terrorist who ended up opening fire there or blowing himself up did a little bit of surveillance. Realized that that the end of the concert was a very soft area because large-scale events tend to soften down in terms of security, and then blew himself up at the crowded area right near the tube station. London Bridge can also be protected. I'm not a structural engineer, but I can tell you that bollards can be put in place to divide the driving area from the pedestrians who are walking on the London Bridge or riding bicycles. I can tell you that there's 40,000 people who cross that bridge a day just by Googling it, and it's a national symbol in London. And why you can't, but to answer, to agree with you to some extent, like, you can't protect every bridge and you can't protect every event, but you can certainly implore or lay down, and I've been saying this for years, a multi-layered security apparatus so that it would take a multi-failure event in order for the terrorist to reach its target. And what I mean by that is every layer would have to fail. Now, the police response was very fast. 8 minutes is good in any country, so hats off to those responding counter-terror officers who were armed. But that's just one layer. We need to be looking in London. And London it almost feels like it's under siege right now. We've seen 2-3 attacks in the last, 20 days. There are security measures that can be done, and every soft target cannot be treated with soft security. We found that out in Israel over 25 years ago. So these layers can be applied. And I think that while the British and the U.S. they're applying pressure overseas, the more pressure they apply, the more defense we're going to have to be put on. And an honest, realistic look has to be approached with all of these soft targets. Otherwise, we're going to see more terror.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, it's a city of 8 million people with, as you mentioned, many bridges, many landmarks, many, high-profile targets. There are millions of tourists in the UK as we speak. So obviously, this is an area where you might see many of those types of patrons and customers and pedestrians. Bobby, though, 3 assailants were killed by authorities. So it's not one person or even 2, it's 3. So presumably, if they got together and planned this, I mean, authorities are going to have to look back at whether or not they missed communication between them, or if this had been something that they had spoken about, maybe shared with other people, right? I mean, that's the kind of intelligence gathering they need to do now, looking back, kind of backtracking to how this all started.
And I think they've already started. Obviously, they've probably already started that process. And I think we will find out more in the coming days. However, as you mentioned earlier, the mechanism of attack here was so crude and so basic that they didn't really need a lot of help. They didn't need a network to provide some of this stuff. They didn't need a bomb maker. They didn't need technical expertise to any of this. So this could be 3 thugs that that turned to this ideology, decided to get a van and a couple of big knives and carry this out. So I'm not so sure that they needed to have a big network. They may have talked, looking back on some of these events, a lot of times family members could have clued somebody in. They talked about it, but sometimes not. And with an event like this, because the mode was so crude, they may not have talked to a lot of people other than themselves. I mean, and to an earlier point, 8 minutes is a good response time. However, for me, it's in the city where I'm from, New York City, in a landmark like the London Bridge, if you had something equal to that in New York City, the response time would be half that, if that, and probably less than half that. And when, I read a report about an hour ago that said, 2 of the community police officers in the area ran the other way, away from these attackers because they were unarmed, the community police there. So, the London authorities have to start thinking about, pushing some weapons and weapons training down to more police officers in the street, especially around tourist areas like that. Now, these don't have to be guns. They can be less than lethal modes, but, tasers and beanbags. But they have to start thinking in those terms, that we have to start arming the officers in the street with the capability not to run away from these attackers if they have a big machete. But you know what? If I'm a cop and I don't have any means to defend myself other than my own 2 hands.
Yeah, I was despite that, it took them 8 minutes, the armed officers, to get to the scene. So it wasn't like there was a huge delay because the beat cops weren't armed.
Right, but if the beat cops were armed, they would have, we have to see at what point those beat cops may have been there 2 minutes later. It wasn't, but they're not armed, so they can't take action against armed assailants. So you have, the UK has to start maybe, and like Aaron said, London seems to be under siege now, and when you're under siege, you may have to change your methods a little bit, and they have to start.
Bobby's spot on. For every second you waste, another innocent person is killed. That's how it works. That's the mathematical equation with terror. And the London police, the weapons have to sink down to the patrol level. You don't have time to wait for specialized units. Let me explain how we look at the triangle of counter-terror response in my unit in Israel. For every second wasted, another innocent is killed. For every round you miss firing at a terrorist, another innocent is killed. You don't have time. The response has to be rapid, has to be aggressive, shots have to be fired straight, and the officers need to be trained in how to fire bullets into a crowd of people. And that takes specialized training, and that needs to get to patrol. So 100% on Bobby's answer.
All right, Aaron Cohen and Bobby Chacon, thanks very much. This is definitely a conversation I know this country will have regarding how to respond to these attacks, and also to the threat, and also how to gather the type of intelligence you need to make sure that plots are thwarted before they become a horrific attack that takes the lives of innocent civilians. Stay with us. We'll have much more on the London terror attacks here from near London Bridge after the break. You're watching CNN.